All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Leanne, and I am the Education Director here at the People's Forum. And I'm so happy to see you all here today. It's really especially special to see you all here today because it feels like ages ago we were all coming here every Tuesday evening and studying Marx with David. And the pandemic, of course, made us have to stop this, but it's really exciting to be able to gather again, and it's especially exciting to have David back with us and this incredible group of thinkers here to discuss his latest book. We have Michael Blim, Chris Caruso, and Vijay Prashad. We're going to discuss the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. And I'm just so excited. Thank you all for coming, and for all of you for taking time out of your evening to be here with us. Before we get started, I have a few logistical things. One is that I'm going to ask, since we are recognizing that the pandemic is not yet over, for all our audience members to please keep your mask on unless you're eating or drinking. We also have drinks and snacks available at the cafe, and more importantly, we have copies of David's book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, and many other copies of Vijay's titles and other interesting titles you might want to see in our new bookstore, 1804 Books. And lastly, you should all have on your seats a copy of our open letter to President Biden. If you haven't seen already, this was published as a full-page ad this morning in the New York Times. We are demanding that Biden lift the blockade and end all sanctions on Cuba. A special thanks. A special thanks to Vijay Prashad, Chris Caruso, and David Harvey for being signatories of this letter, and to everyone who has signed and shared since then. You can still sign if you go online to letcubalive.com. You can add your name, and please share it as widely as possible with your networks. So with that, I would like to introduce our dear friend Chris Caruso, who will be moderating this event for us today. Chris Caruso is the founding director of the People's Forum, founding education director of the People's Forum. He is a popular educator, an organizer, and educational technologist, and he is a first-generation college student who received his PhD under David Harvey at the CUNY Graduate Center, and is tirelessly supporting us with advice and friendship and accompaniment throughout our project here at the People's Forum. So thank you, Chris, for everything and for being here today, and welcome.
Thank you, Leanne. Can people hear me? Is this all right? Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and it's really a pleasure to be back in person here at TPF. So I'm going to give some brief introductory remarks, introduce the panel, and explain how it's going to go. So we all know David Harvey is a distinguished professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He really needs no introduction, and I will get into serious trouble if I spend too much time going on about him. We know that his academic influence is vast, not just in his home field of geography, but across the social sciences and humanities. But what I did want to spend a few minutes talking about is David's influence as a public intellectual. And in preparing for tonight, I went back and read an article David wrote on the publication of his 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism in 2014, where he was reflecting on what he called his Marx project. And he talked about having two goals for that Marx project, of combating the ignorance of Marx in the US Academy, both on the right and from the kind of more dogmatic academic Marxists, to make Marx more accessible. And he said at that time, I wanted to open a door into Marxist thinking so that readers could pass through it and create their own understandings on the other side. And the second goal he talked about for his Marx project is feeling this pressing need to illustrate the contemporary relevance of Marx's thinking for politics today. And going back at least to the publication of his book, The New Imperialism, in 2003, we could see David aiming increasingly at a more general and popular audience and not writing just for the academy, and a whole series of books like A Brief History of Neoliberalism and Rebel Cities and more. And in 2014, after the publication of 17 Contradictions, he publicly said that would likely be the last book in his Marx project. And he used to say the same thing to me personally after each of these books in this Marx project, and every time he would, I would kind of suppress a minor heart attack and I wanted to yell at him, like, are you crazy? You're David Harvey. But every time he tries to get out, Marx keeps pulling him back in. And so the Marx Project has continued despite David's best efforts. And in fact, I'd like to be the first to announce that David made much more productive use of his time in lockdown than I did. And his companion to Marx's Grundrisse is going to be coming out next year.
Bravo.
And it's based in part, although substantially revised, from his class on the Grundrisse that actually began in person here and continued online as the pandemic hit. But in addition to being a prolific author, David's also famously taught Marx's Capital almost every year since 1971. And in 2008, he and I produced the Reading Marx's Capital with David Harvey online course, which attracted a huge global audience and was viewed over 4.5 million times in over 200 countries. And the impact of that was really large in terms of hundreds of self-organized capital reading groups around the globe and a spontaneous crowdsourced initiative of translating those first lectures into over 45 languages. And we've since worked together to create 4 more online courses. And in 2018, David teamed up with Democracy at Work to produce a bi-weekly podcast called the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles. And this book that we're here to celebrate today was inspired by that podcast, and it's written in a kind of conversational style, which we see as a kind of new, accessible entry point to his larger body of work. And by keeping the length of each chapter short and the ability to kind of read as a standalone text, we set out to make this as a tool for popular education, and each chapter is paired with discussion questions and further recommended readings. And so it was really a pleasure to get to work on putting this book together with David. And so I will leave at that for David's introduction, and then I'd like to introduce Vijay Prashad, who is a Marxist historian and journalist, the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which you should all check out the website and subscribe. Their ongoing reports are invaluable for understanding our world today. He's also the chief editor at Leftward Books, a 20-year-old Marxist publishing house in New Delhi, and has written quite a few books, I believe over 25, including The Darker Nations, The Poorer Nations, and many, many more. And he was a professor at Trinity College for quite a while before embarking on Tricontinental, and we're very lucky to have him today. And Michael Blim is professor emeritus of anthropology and a colleague of David's from the CUNY Graduate Center. I think I could say working in the tradition of Eric Wolf, specializing in issues around political economy, equality, and labor. He's the author of Equality and Economy, The Global Challenge, Made in Italy, Small-Scale Industrialization and Its Consequences, and co-edited Objectification and Standardization on the Limits and Effects of Ritually Fixing and Measuring Life, as well as Anthropology and the Global Factory. And his next book, which I'm very excited about, is on the rise of the American ruling class, 1865 to 1920. So we're all looking forward to that. So the format is going to be that David's going to give some remarks, followed by responses from Vijay and Michael, followed by a reply from David, and then we'll open up for some questions and answers from the crowd. But before I hand the floor over to David, if you would indulge me for another moment, I've really personally learned so much from each of our panelists today and consider them my teachers. And I'd like to just share that each of these 3 men are not only distinguished scholars and socially engaged public intellectuals, but they're just decent and kind human beings. They don't put on airs, they make time for their students and ordinary folks. They treat people with dignity and respect. And these qualities are too rare in our academy, too rare among the left. And I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David.
You've already seen I'm hopeless with technology, so Chris not only does all of my tweeting and other things, but he even turns my microphone on for me. Where would I be without you? Well, it's wonderful to be back in this space. Fantastic. And I hope this is the first of many occasions when we can, really get together and start to talk about serious things. I want to thank the members of the panel in advance, just in case they say some horrible things in between and I can't do it at the end.
Sorry.
All right, Vijay, it's fine. So, but the podcast came about and I was not very convinced about it and decided to do it. I don't prepare for them. I ad-lib and I get into all kinds of trouble for saying things that I shouldn't have said, but that's the way of podcasts. So when the proposal came that we might turn this into a book, I thought it was a bad idea. I thought it was a very bad idea, and I didn't want to do it. But then Chris looked at me and said, well, you said that about the capital classes, which I did, and that was a very, very good idea. So I decided I better not only have him turn on my microphone, but take over the question of what was or was not a good idea. And so this is what came out. There's a great deal of variety in the texts and a great deal of uneven development, if you like, of arguments. And I felt, however, that it would perhaps provide an easier way for people to get into many of the issues that concern me and which concern us all, and add a different dimension a little bit to the Marx project that Chris has mentioned. As usual, a lot of the work was done for me, getting the text transcribed, and then there had to be some pretty drastic editing here and there to make sense of some of the things. But in the end, I think it says something and is helpful. I have, of course, changed my mind about a lot of things since then. And one of the things that I have tried to bring to the Marx project is the idea that Marx's thought is not a sort of fixed bag of tricks that you grab on and use. It's something which is constantly providing inspiration to think about things in a different kind of way. And when you've decided that you should think about it this way, you read something else by Marx, then think, well, maybe I should be doing it that way. So I wanted to keep it as open as possible. And I think to that degree that that is represented in these various essays which are in the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, I think it could possibly be helpful to the Marx project as part and parcel of the package that might go into it. So with those few remarks as a general point, let me turn over to the commentators and let's hear what they have to say.
That was quick. I was hoping for more.
You'll get it, don't worry.
Well, nice to be here, friends. It's great to be with, David Harvey. David Harvey. Today is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. It's a pretty significant date. By your tepid applause, I'm guessing that you have a mixed reaction to the Communist Party of China. Today, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which I direct, has released a report called Serve the People. Oh, sorry. Well, worse than you, really. Worse than you. I thought it was all okay. Let me repeat myself. Today's the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, and there we go. That's a much better. And I see you're not clapping.
I'm thinking about it.
You're thinking about it. Okay, that's Michael's problem there. Tricontinental, thetricontinental.org. You can download for free in many languages a report called Serve the People, which was put together by our team in Shanghai, and it's a report on the abolition of extreme poverty in China. 800 million people lifted out of poverty. Now, I was born in India in 1967, a very fine year, 2 years before Ho Chi Minh died. And that's important because yesterday I just finished the introduction to my selected Ho Chi Minh. Friends, I've been working on that book since 1996. Don't make air quotes. It's done now. So it's an incredibly important study. I'd like you to look at it. We released it today as an homage to the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China has done amazing things to lift people out of poverty. Imagine, I grew up in India. India has as many people in extreme poverty today as China has lifted out of extreme poverty. Just imagine that. If you had a choice to be born in China or in India, where would you pick? Unless you were born in the Ambani or Adani family. If you were born in a slum in India or in a working class family in China, where would you choose? It's easy for people in the United States to have this or that criticism of China, but you don't understand what it means to be born in a country that had been colonized and lived with a wretched old culture. You just don't get it, guys. You live on the other side of imperialism. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. You know, I read this book with a great deal of enjoyment. One of the reasons I really enjoyed it is this has, in a very conversational way, all the major themes of David Harvey's work since the 1960s. It has his really gripping sense of what urbanism is to capitalism. It has his fascination, and he says it, a term he likes, spatial fix. It has the spatial fix explained, I think, as clearly as you'll get in any of his other texts. But more importantly, the chapter on accumulation by dispossession, which I didn't know was a term that came from Arrighi, is an incredibly useful summary of this vital concept of accumulation by dispossession. It has these in a very conversational way. This is an incredibly useful book. And David, thanks for doing it, honestly. Chris is the better judge than you of anything that you do, David. Anything that you do. Just listen to Chris. Not only does Chris put your mic on, thanks, Leon. Thanks a lot. But it's a really good book for that, you know, because it puts together for you, I would say, some of the principal things that have detained David over the course of these last decades. So I think it's really vital, it's important, and you know how important David's work is, so I'm not going to spend time in going over that. Instead, of course, I'm going to talk about what preoccupies me and what I didn't see in the book, David. So in that sense, it's really about me now, which, you know, I'm sorry, guys, you came to hear about David, but this section is about me. There are three things I'd like to talk about, which I think are pretty important. One of them is, of course, David has been for a while in a debate, a public debate, with Prabhat and Utsa Patnaik and with John Smith on the question of imperialism. And it is striking, though, reading the book, how imperialism doesn't really come in except in the margins. It's not a structuring concept. And I would like David to talk a little bit, because I know David thinks about these things greatly. How do we really understand the fact that the United States spends more on its military force than any country on the planet, and then, you know, more than the next, I think, 9 or 10 countries in the world? Why are there so many US bases? How are we to understand the hybrid war that the United States prosecutes against Cuba, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Syria, you know, you name it, friends, including, of course, China? David has a very interesting perspective on why the United States is going after China, which I completely agree with. It's a question of technology, the question of capital-intensive production. 100% agree with the argument. But where is the concept of imperialism in this? I would like David to reflect on that for us. I'm not really that interested in the debate with the Patnaiks and with John Smith, because I think that's a different kind of question, David, that they have raised. It's at a different level. but how thinking about some of these issues of why it is that certain countries can't or shouldn't be allowed to move from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production, what are extra economic pressures to be called other than imperialism? I mean, China is not asking the United States to stop doing capital-intensive production. So China, in that sense, is not being imperialist against the United States. There are no Chinese warships off the coast of New York City the last time I looked. There's plenty of US warships, and now one unfortunate, bedraggled British warship. When did they begin to... The HMS, of all things, Queen Elizabeth, I mean, for God's sake, she's still alive. The HMS Queen Elizabeth sailing off half the crew has COVID. I mean, it's a miserable, it's like the opium war on acid, I don't understand what the British are doing. They have a country that's falling apart, and yet they've decided they've got to go poke the Chinese, for what reason? So the first set of considerations, I think, is to raise the question, is it important to have the concept imperialism somehow appear in the text? And I wonder how it would appear, if not grounded in the material structure of this prevention of the shift from labor-intensive production to capital-intensive production. The second set of considerations, I'm very interested in the Leninist break. And by the way, I didn't plan to wear this T-shirt, okay? It's just that I grab a T-shirt off the shelf and put it on. Okay, I'm not like that. I would have worn a Ho Chi Minh T-shirt to celebrate the final completion of the book. But no, I wore this old Lenin shirt. The Leninist consideration to me is important. It's very interesting that in all the texts on Western Marxism, Lenin gets skipped. If you look at, say, Perry Anderson's considerable survey of Western Marxism, and he does it twice, by the way, he has 2 books on it. In both books, Lenin doesn't figure. He jumps from the second international thinkers over them to Gramsci or to Karl Koch or to, let's say, some of the more significant French figures. They skip Lenin, and I think that's significant. Ho Chi Minh doesn't skip Lenin. Lenin is, in fact, the beginning for them. Lenin is the beginning because what Lenin says is if you come from a colonized part of the world, the productive forces will not be developed for you there. Imperialism will not develop the productive forces. Therefore, you have to have a dual agenda, which Marx didn't think about. That's why Gramsci celebrated the Soviet Revolution as a revolt against capital. The book Capital, in fact. This is a revolt against the book. We need to take that seriously. We shouldn't duck that. What Lenin argued in the thesis to the Comintern 1920, which, Ho Chi Minh reads in L'Humanité and says, my God, the sun came out in the sky for me. I'd never read anything like this. What that Leninist breakthrough suggests is that we have to consider that you've got to push an anti-colonial national liberation strategy simultaneously with the socialist revolution, simultaneously with the social revolution, land reform and so on. You've got to move there. And we have to build the productive forces because, we can't wait for 1,000 years. And anyway, imperialism is never going to allow us to build the productive forces. So we've got to have this breakthrough. Consideration of that Leninist moment, I think, helps us understand so much of what Marxism does outside North Atlantic states. And I think that's another area, of consideration. If we neglect Lenin, I think we neglect that seam of Marxism that is developed outside the North Atlantic. Even Walden Bellow, in his introduction to the Verso edition of Ho Chi Minh, says he's not a theorist. I take great objection to that. This view that theorists are only, in the academy in the West, whereas Ho Chi Minh or Mao are not theorists. Read them carefully, you will find a theory there. Isn't that what Gramsci said? Elaboration, elaborate theory out of practice. That's the obligation of the new intellectual. So the second set of considerations, I think, is where is Lenin in our thinking? Where is this Leninist moment, which actually is very important for 90% of the Marxists in the world, if not more. So that's the second set of considerations. The third set of considerations is what's the post-capitalist future? And, I have to say, David, I read the first chapter and I stopped myself because I said, I'm reading this wrong. And in fact, I read right through and I was talking to Chris about it. But by the time I got to the last chapter, I realized that there is an issue here that I would like you to, clarify. In the first chapter, David talks about how capitalism is too big to fail. And that's an interesting issue because this raises the question of socialism. I think David is right in one sense that a post-capitalist situation today on a global scale, in other words, what used to be called in the communist international literature, the world revolution, is not going to happen in our time, perhaps, okay? We never know what happens, I mean, imagine, do you think that the Russians sitting in Switzerland, like Lenin, thought there'd be a revolution in the largest country in the world? I don't think they thought that. Not at Zimmerwald. They certainly didn't think that at Zimmerwald. That was only 2.5 years before a revolution breaks out. So God knows what's going to happen, friends. We are living in a permanent COVID catastrophe. The way in which people are piss mad about the world as it is, we don't know what's going to happen. But I take the point that advanced capitalism is so sophisticated right now, it's so integrated, labor is so socialized, it's difficult to imagine properly the possibility of making socialism or even a socialist experiment in one country. Look at how the experiments are being sanctioned, the blockades and so on. These are firm and difficult. I take that point. On the other hand, I wonder very much if it's too big to fail, because in a way, capitalism is a failure for most people. It is actually existential failure already. So it's not a question of we will starve in the future. If we break down capitalism, we are already starving. 2 to 3 billion people on the planet are already in starvation. So I'm thinking about this post-capitalist issue. I think we should think about it quite seriously. For me, the post-capitalist moment has to be understood now. We can't suspend it till later. Now, I take very seriously the line in the German ideology where Marx and Engels write that, look, guys, don't be idealists, okay? Communism isn't something that you impose outside into the world. Communism is the real movement of history. It's a very important section of the German ideology. I've never really understood Althusser. I tried my best to read it. I never really picked up on the young Marx, old Marx. I just see a thinker trying to understand things, and he makes changes all the time in his life. It's not like young Marx and old Marx is enough. Marx is constantly changing, even in the so-called old Marx, as David says in this book, while he's writing Capital 1, he's already writing Capital 3. So David very carefully and cleverly says, when he's talking about rate and mass, he has a question he raises, the answer is in Capital 3, because he's noting that down over there. Marx is always changing, always thinking, young, old, I'm not sure. But certainly, in the German ideology, this is a significant point, that we don't impose our views onto the world. It doesn't work like that. We have to look at the real motion of history. And in a sense, the real movement of history requires us to look at places like China, look at what they are doing, understand what are the experiments. Let's understand what's happening in Vietnamese public health. How is it that in Vietnam, they had such a low COVID fatality rate? How is that? Because they have an extraordinarily good public health system, which was praised in 1978 at the Alma Ata meeting of the World Health Organization. And they absorbed traditional Vietnamese medicine into modern medicine in the same way as the Chinese absorbed old Chinese medicine into modern medicine. They didn't neglect it or laugh at it, etc. They were clever. And they built a structure of rural medicine. You see, I'm going to say a few things and then I'll end there, Chris. I know you told me speak as much as you want. It's a dangerous business. But what I want to say is, these countries, as part of the Leninist project, because they understood the worker-peasant alliance, and you can't write about the world today without agriculture. The worker-peasant alliance, they moved towards different forms of land reform in an early way. Now, it's true in Vietnam, North Vietnam in particular, 53 they had land reform. By 56 they were criticizing themselves, very severely. I'm not interested in the criticism. What I'm interested in is what they don't talk about. When you go after landlordism, you create the possibility in a rural area to create collective structures of social welfare. See, this is something you don't think about if you don't understand rural areas. When landlords have a grip on rural society, they don't permit collective structures of social welfare to be built because they create patron-client relations. I know this fundamentally from looking at caste structures in India. Landlords don't want caste to be attacked because caste for them is a mechanism of social control, and they want to be the ones who provide social goods when there's a catastrophe. When you get rid of the landlords, as they did in Vietnam after 53, you can create collective structures of social welfare, and that's what you see in Vietnam today. I have traveled in rural Vietnam, and you get to see there this incredible sense of rural social welfare institutions that provide health and education and retirement schemes. David makes a really good point about how pensions are being stolen in the West. It's not happening in those countries because pension structures are rooted in these collective structures in rural areas. Got to look at those as well. The whole world is not identical to the West. That's something I want you to think about. Agrarian parts of the world are fighting deep struggles to defeat landlordism. That's got to be the center of our focus. Most people in the world today are still living most people in the world in Asia are still living in rural areas. That fight is the key fight. So, I made 3 points, David. I hope those were pretty clear in my own way, rambling, non-theoretical, non-Althusserian, non-properly scholaristic way. But these are things I said from the heart. David Harvey is somebody that I like to think with a lot. This is an important book, and I'm really proud and happy to share this moment, David, to say to people, please read this. It's going to help you. If you've never read David Harvey, this is a really good introduction. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Now it works, yeah. Yes, David and I were colleagues for 20 years at the Graduate Center. It was one of the great honors of my career. To work day in and day out with him, with graduate students who always needed a helping hand, who always needed a little advice, who needed a little bit of a gentle touch. We fought the good fight and kept some of the barbarians in our midst from tearing the graduate students apart, which I really think was one of the most important things that we did there. Certainly not all that he did there, but half the time I think that's what I did. I'm glad I did it. Let me just say, though, I've schooled with David's work for 40 years. I feel still his student. I can remember different times when I would get the new book. I remember one time in the Boston Common, I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I got my copy of the Postmodernity book, and I was sitting with one of my mentors, and we said, well, he's really done it. She was very unhappy because she was writing a book about postmodern architecture. But anyway, it's been a joy to work with him. And he's kind of a modern-day Archimedes, I mean, he took a lever and he lifts the world. And it's that kind of decisive, intellectual endeavor that is really so extraordinary and something that came through year after year, as a student of his work, but also year after year working with him and working with students and realizing what it all meant to us. And I'm so glad to be here tonight. I really enjoyed the book. It was like furthering the conversation. It just felt like we were back, having coffee and talking, or maybe having a glass of wine and talking. It depended. A beer, that kind of thing. We did find out, though, we used to go to a bar near the Graduate Center, and we'd go en masse, just like, that kind of thing. Pints all around, that thing. And we found out that actually the bill would come back, about 4 hours later. And we'd all look at each other and say, we drank that much? And what we discovered, of course, is, they were padding the bill like at double time, figuring we'd be so drunk, we wouldn't know how much we drunk. And they were right. But I want to talk about 3 things. Seriously, though. One is, in the book, David raises a very significant point. Just point blank. He says the legitimacy of neoliberalism was cracked open and broken by the crisis of 2007, 2008, which I believe is a statement that just has to be really worked with because it's so important. And it struck me that, now what has it been? We're now 13 years later. God, it's unbelievable. And we look at the situation, and it struck me, yes, and we've come to the point where there is no more legitimacy in all of these states for their neoliberal programs, and they really don't have anything else except for printing money, and we'll talk about that another time. But the point is that they've lost their guidance, and so what happens? Well, if consent is out, and I'll talk about that in a minute, coercion is the answer, okay? So you take, for instance, I just for kicks, I kind of like to do something like this. I took, of course, the current rate of disaffection with the vaccination, which runs about 25% of the American population, up to 40%, by the way, in Germany and France. Just want you to know they're right with us. And then I compared it with the polio campaign between 1955 and 1963. I'll tell you why in a minute. The polio campaign vaccinated 98 million people in the space of a couple of years. It eliminated polio from the United States, and then that program was sent out, and slowly but surely we've eliminated polio in almost every intersection in the world, except for a couple where there was still some serious problems. But nonetheless, what's interesting about it is there were no anti-vaccination campaigns. There was no resistance to the vaccine. And it's also peculiar because there was a dramatic screw-up. They circulated at first a vaccine that infected 40,000 people, put 200 people in various forms of paralysis, and killed 10 people, okay? But nonetheless, it was a universally accepted program of vaccination. Now, what do we see here? We see instead a society now which must be coerced, right, into doing what seems to be the best thing, right? A state that cannot compel, short of coercion, or induce people, or incentivize people, short of coercion, to take on this public health emergency. And it tells us what? That in certain ways, symptomatically, David's idea needs to be explored deeply. Because I think what we see is, therefore, a sense that certainly in the global north, the neoliberal program is shot. It's certainly shot in the south. But we see what, unfortunately, is the residue. And the residue is more and more the state resorts to coercion. I mean, we also know about other forms of coercion. It's not my job to get into them tonight. But, people have talked about the Janus nature, the two-sided or Janus nature of the coercive force that's being used right now, that I won't get into today, but to just suggest, though, that we have a crisis of legitimacy that is, sort of apparent. And it leads to, in a certain sense, also a lot of work on our part because it is precisely a kind of negative, if you like, event or process that is going in the wrong direction. For instance, let's take a look at the refloating programs in the UE and the United States and Canada. I mean, the modern monetary theory is on. We'll throw all the money we can at the problem. Don't worry about it. More money, more money, more money. And yet, the popular opinion doesn't change. No one goes, hey, now we've got a government that knows what they're talking about. It's really a good time. We're over the hump now. Let's get more, solidarity is a possibility now. No, people feel like they don't really trust that this is real, or they take the money and run, or they take the money and they say, they're a bunch of assholes anyway. No, I'm serious, right? In other words, it's the political devices of liberal regimes are broken. Even money doesn't buy goodwill, so to speak, right? And that is the symptom that Dave is pointing to when he says, look, the legitimacy was broken in 2008, and now we're reaping the consequences of that, unfortunately, not always in the best light, okay? That's the first point. The second is, David brings up alienation once more, which, frankly, has been sort of, people, alienation, they go, oh, wasn't that something like Marcuse? What was that stuff, And David's right in the book. He says, well, it really was dissed by a lot of the socialist theorists who felt like alienation was really a physical process and it really had nothing to do with the being. And, the earlier move of the Frankfurt School to introduce alienation as coming from the so-called earlier, younger Marx was discredited, okay? But how do you make sense of the world now if you don't begin to take in again a deeper sense of alienation as not simply, okay, the alienation of workers from their product and their labor, but also, in a certain sense, the deeper consequences of that alienation? David and I were walking over and I said, I mean, without some theory of some deeper forces at work, what I mean by that is stuff that's not manifest to us. I mean, in other words, you and I sit there and we go, what in the hell's going on with those people in Oklahoma? Right? What's going on in their minds? Well, because right now, we don't understand. We don't have a way of understanding what's motivating that and the resistance to the vaccine and the resistance to civil government and the resistance to even being bribed by the federal government under a Democratic administration. We have all these things that are suggesting a deeper current of dissatisfaction that is even perhaps not fully available to those who carry it, okay? That is to say, I'm obviously skating around the word unconscious because I'll clear the room if I use it. But the point is, it seems to me that something like a deep current where we lack awareness, we and the others, of what's really triggering these responses or what coordinates the linkages of those responses is something that David speaks about. And I'm glad to see it back because, subjectivity and Marxist humanism, frankly, is something you assign in the third week. Then you move on. And it's really treated as a kind of historic doorstop with a lot of great writing. But I think it's actually far more significant now because it's not manifest, right? What the nature of our social environment is now. It's just not manifest. It's not something that you and I can understand without really trying to predicate some linkages that are not apparent like this glass of water, okay? The third point I want to raise is that David talks about a very interesting thing. He talks about, it's a very simple idea, but it's very, very important. He says, a lot of people get hung up on the rate of surplus value. And of course, then, Paul Krugman, our other colleague, gets caught up with the rate of growth, right? The economic growth, and talks about it. The idea being that, in other words, the way you judge yourself is the rate, right, of growth. And that's how you measure your effectiveness as a party, as a regime, as a government, whatever, right? In other words, everything's based upon, that kind of magical rate, whether it's the interest rate or whatever. The point being that he says, well, wait a minute, if you pay attention to the rate at the exclusion of looking at the mass, then you're not going to understand something. He says, first of all, the simple example is that suppose the rate of compensation for poor folks during a COVID dilemma or COVID crisis is a 10% return, right, on their income. And it's a 5% return for people who are not poor but who are rich. Guess who gets more money, right? In other words, the millionaire at 5% is making out, and the person who's making 25 a year and is getting 2,500 back is, obviously, the inequality grows; it doesn't shrink. But what he points out, and I think here's the implication, and a kind of tip for where we can go. And we were talking about this earlier, and it's something that I think it's very interesting, is that we want to start talking about the mass of an economy, right? That is to say, if we reproduce ourselves more slowly, if that is to say a large economy like this, or Europe, or China for that matter, if we slow down the rate of reproduction, we slow down the rate at which we make new problems, right? That is to say, we slow down the rate at which we create new capital that must be deployed, and more capital and more profit or surplus value that is spent buying consumer goods we don't need. He talks about this issue, of course, consumer fetishism, and so on. So that in other words, if you begin to think of a society that has turnover of 1% a year, and you have a socialized distribution of income, you may be just fine. And you're creating less environmental hassle, and you're also getting off in a certain way from creating more havoc down the road for your economy in a sense of social justice, as well as in the sense of ecology. So those are the things that are on my mind about it. The final thing is that David has been bringing back in his work, but I just want to punch it. He brings back in a very gracious way the work of the social democrat Karl Polanyi. Now, Polanyi is not everybody's favorite. I didn't teach him for years out of spite. But I began to see the error of my ways about, maybe 8 or 9 years ago when I finally said, all right, Karl, come on back. But the point was that as a social democrat, Polanyi understood and could incorporate elements of the bourgeois concept of freedom, okay? The freedom to be, the freedom to experience, the freedom to have ideas of your own and to execute and self-realize, right? That were, again, coming out of that more bourgeois liberal tradition, were filtering through into his appropriation of political economy. And David simply points out that Polanyi's notion of freedom is a freedom that socialism wants to bring, right? It's a socialism that includes not only social realization, but also individual or self-realization, right? I mean, this goes back many different places in Marx, but it's there also in, if you bring in another, if you like, another witness to the scene, in a lot of the social democratic literature, which is helpful. So that what I found in the book, finally, is this, an openness to bringing back material that he's known. I mean, don't forget, David's also sent many of us into social research with his concepts, many, no? We've used them as research tools. But this is something else. This book is more like an exploration of him thinking about stuff, right? And stuff that includes, where we might be if we weren't trying to defend ourselves intellectually on every paragraph, right? And we were saying, that Polanyi, that notion of social freedom, that's important, and he's been dissed by 2 generations of Marxist scholars, but, it's interesting, right? Or or even the anarchist vision of Andre Gorz, of self-creation, of community, and so forth he brings in, right? That's the kind of, what I liked was the openness and the consideration of how to build a stance in this strange world, and how you can bring in various supporters, if you like, to elaborate your point of view and make a pretty darn good book. So I thank David for doing it, and thanks.
Okay, a couple of preliminary remarks. First off, I'm 85 years old and I can't remember where the hell I read most of the stuff that I think about. This makes for a very embarrassing thing that you write something and you're very pleased with it, and then somebody points out that somebody wrote it in 1974. And it becomes even more embarrassing when you find out that you wrote it in 1974. So one of the problems I get into sometimes with people on the left is, we quote Lenin and we quote everybody, and after a bit, I'm kind of going, I can't remember exactly what they said and why they said it in the way they did. It's all sort of gone into some mush in my brain, and some of this comes out as well. The only line I have from Lenin that I really like, and I'm sure you like, and you could tell me where it is, because it turns out it's probably apocryphal. And that is the idea that trust is good, control is better. That's the revolutionary slogan. I think it's very good. I think it's a very good one. So anyway, that's my Lenin contribution for the night. The second thing is that as with everybody, there are certain perspectives that you have and certain contributions you can make from those perspectives. There are other perspectives I don't have, and I have to rely upon people like Vijay and to explain what they are from the standpoint of, say, of Indian rural life and the like. I would say this comes back to this kind of question about socialism and the possibilities of socialism in our time. Because, yes, there are large segments of the world that still are agrarian in their economy and their basis, but I think they've been steadily disappearing and they're being eroded. I've been watching that in Latin America, for example, that were viable kind of communas and so on are no longer viable, and they've been disrupted and destroyed. So that, yes, there is still that possibility there, but you mentioned the eradication of poverty in China, which is a tremendous achievement, tremendous. But notice that it's also being connected with urbanization. And in fact, rural life in China has been transformed dramatically. And one of the things that I really appreciated when I was there was that they would take me out to some rural areas and start to show me how they were trying to revitalize their rural areas. And they were not being revitalized necessarily around agricultural production, because a lot of their agricultural production is becoming industrialized and all the rest of it. They were actually, I mean, so it is impressive, but to the degree that China has urbanized its populations, you're then dealing with the question of how to create socialist world in the midst of this massive urbanization. And when you're there, I mean, I was fortunate to spend a month a year for 3 years there. And the first year I'm there, so they would say things to me like that, well, you know, the downtown's not working very efficiently. And you'd say, well, it looks all right to me. The next year you go there and half of it was already demolished. And the third year you go there and they built a new town right out on the edge. I mean, it's really phenomenal. It's phenomenal what they're doing. But this then gets me into the question of the mass. And in 2008, China basically saved the world from global collapse by its development. What was it doing? It was building cities. It was building urbanization. It was building infrastructures. It built 20,000-mile high-speed rail network, everything. It consumed more cement in 2 years than the United States had consumed in 100 years. Okay? Then you think of the environmental consequences. And so then you say to yourself, well, you know, I want to write about these things and think about these things and what's happening to them. And this gets me back a little bit to the notion of imperialism. I'm not against imperialism. I think some of the things you mentioned are very, very important. And, I'm you know, yes, it's there. But for me, what I start to think about is I think about, you know, the commodity chains that exist. If we have socialism, are we going to have computers? If we're going to have computers, who's going to make them? How are they going to be made? What about the chips and all the rest of it? And what about the sort of long stream of things that come into making a computer? And so when I said this is too big to fail, if we abolish all the computers in the world tomorrow, fine, and then we start to. But on the other hand, if we're going to use computers, then presumably somebody's going to have to make them, and the commodity and the assembly of the computer. So there was things like that. I'm saying to myself, well, we're going to need them, and we'll need them to try to coordinate and structure what we're doing. And, you know, and people that I've come across in anarchist communes, and they still have computers and they coordinate with each other. It's very important they do. And that's great. But on the other hand, somebody has to make the damn computers, and they have to work. And we have to have a kind of infrastructure that makes it work. And frankly, you can say, well, you can you know, nationalize it. Well, you know, I think state taking it over doesn't necessarily make it better. It can in some circumstances and others not. So what I was trying to do there was to say, well, you know, in the long haul, I would want to hang on to some of the things that the capitalists created. And this is one of the things that struck me, and I did talk about this a little bit in the book, but in the Grundrisse, Marx has these two accounts. One is, you know, the history of capital in terms of its fantastic contribution to human knowledge and understanding and everything else, that we are now in a position to understand and to work with things. I mean, yeah, and then the other one kind of says, but you know, the interesting thing is that this is all going on, but it's empty. It's hollowed out. It's vulgar. It doesn't give satisfaction. And you kind of go, well, you know, this is pretty much where I'm at. On the one hand, I love my Alexa system because I wrote a utopian piece back in 1999. And one of the things that went on the utopian piece is that everybody should have complete access to all of the cultural things that have ever been there and all of the music and that kind of stuff. And I can go to Alexa and say, Alexa, play me John Coltrane, blah, play me Stravinsky, play me Shostakovich, you know. And I think it's great. But then I kind of think there's something wrong with this. And it's these sorts of contradictions, it seems to me, that we really need to think about and talk about. And it's not because I have, you know, I've been subtly caught up with the bourgeoisie because I like Stravinsky or something, you know. It's not that. There's a real serious question. Now, there is a lot of uneven geographical development in the world. I agree with you entirely. There are, you know, what makes sense in Ecuador or what makes sense in India is different from what makes sense in Finland or what makes sense, you know, so we have to understand all of that. But one of the things that I find in a way is too easy about the way the word imperialism is used is that everything is imperialism. And you know, you're down in Brazil and Argentina and you see the local bourgeoisie are real pigs. And they really need to be taken out. And it's not imperialism, and it's not the IMF, and it's not all of that, you know. Yes, the IMF and imperialism is there. Yes, it's backing things and so on. But I've lost count of the number of times in places like Brazil and Argentina I've found myself in frustration saying, take care of your own bourgeoisie, for God's sake. They're as much the problem. And by the way, you have that problem in China right now. More billionaires arose during the COVID year in China than anywhere else in the world. The power of those huge corporations that are existing right now in China are there. Now, I'm getting a bit of a reputation for being anti-Chinese by pointing out that these are serious problems that need to be addressed. And I actually see them beginning to address it a little bit by kind of saying, oh, you wanted to raise money on Wall Street. Why do you want to make money on Wall Street? Why don't you raise money in Chinese currency, eh? Then if you go bankrupt, we can bail you out. If you go bankrupt in dollars, we may not be able to bail you out. So there's something going on in China. So yes. And the message that I think is terribly important, and I tried to do it in the most recent podcast, is to kind of say, look, there are serious contradictions that exist at a certain historical moment. And they have to get addressed. And as you address them, you generally speaking set up another set of contradictions which you then need to address. So really life is about rolling contradictions, rolling on. And China has overcome certain contradictions. It's also generated some contradictions. And I think there's a certain way of understanding which somehow or other misses the point. And I think the point would be this. Marx in the Grundrisse says something very interesting. He says, well, you know, as this system develops, at a certain point, individuals are ruled by abstractions. And I think this is a very profound notion. How do you fight against an abstraction? How do you struggle against an abstraction? And how is it that we're limited by an abstraction? And the abstractions Marx is talking about are the laws of accumulation of capital. How does capital work? And when you see this as an abstract system, which is actually has its own dynamic and its own logic, and you see that working, then all of us are captured by these abstractions. And when China came into the capitalist system and joined, for example, the WTO is a very good way of thinking about the formulation and the legal structure that exists around the abstractions of capital accumulation. And when China joined the WTO, it had to, in a sense, give up part of its sovereignty to the abstractions. And as I see it, China's history ever since has been a big struggle to try to ward off what are the negative aspects of those abstractions and the fact that you cannot entirely eliminate them. And what they're getting right now is a bunch of contradictions which I think are emerging out precisely of that. And to me, that's a much more important thing to discuss and think about than simply the rules and the crass forms of imperialist power. Now, for me, then, I would not want to say I'm not anti-imperialist in any kind of sense. One of the things that I've always been talking about is saying, look, the geographical transfer of value is something which is going on all of the time, and it goes on at different scales and different notions. You know, how much is New York City living off the value created in rural areas? What's the value transfer going on? And so when I talk about the spatial fix and I'm talking about uneven geographical development, I feel I'm talking about something that's very much more closely on the ground as to what is actually happening than the word imperialism, which has a certain kind of, block logic as it is, and I want to break it down. So I'm very much about how value gets transferred from one part of the world to another. It gets transferred within countries. It gets transferred between corporations. The question of which you mentioned about capital intensity. The transfer of value that occurs through freedom of the market. The transfer of value occurs because what you get is a movement of value, which is a flow from labor-intensive corporations, regions, nations, to capital-intensive. And of course, the one area where people start to ideologically say free trade is the best thing is always the top dog, because they know they have the capital intensity and they are going to get the benefit of this value transfer. And this always happens. The British did. I mean, the whole Manchester School in Britain in the 1850s was about free trade because they had a superior technology. And therefore, they pushed it. When Britain lost its hegemony, it was not so much in favor of free trade. So the top dog always argues for free trade and forces free trade down everybody's throats, as the United States did to the WTO. But then, Donald Trump doesn't like the WTO. And in fact, there are quite a few things that Donald Trump didn't like NATO and WTO and all the rest of it, that I quite agreed with him. The trouble is it's mixed in this other thing. So don't get me like I'm a secret Trumpista. But this, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we want to have a more nuanced understanding of a lot of these things, now there's an interesting phenomena here within Marxist history, which only occurred to me a couple of days ago, And Michael mentioned this notion of rates and masses. The falling rate of profit is a big argument, okay? Actually, when you go back and read the text very carefully, you see that Marx was not talking about the falling rate of profit. He was talking about the falling rate and rising mass of profit. That's what he was talking about. And he saw Ricardo had understood that, but Ricardo had treated these two propositions of falling rate and rising mass somehow or other separate from each other. But that is not the way Marx thinks. Marx thinks there's a contradiction there, there's a unity there, there is a flow there, and that one thing is implicated in the other. So that for Marx, the same process was producing a falling rate and a rising mass. Now, what's more important, the rate or the mass? And as you said, and I read this wonderful Bank of England report about the impact of quantitative easing upon the British population. And it said that over the last 6 years, the bottom 10% had benefited by something like, I don't know, $3,000 or something like that, £3,000 or whatever it was. And the top 10% had benefited by £325,000. So immediately I think, oh, well, But the report said, oh, but in terms of percentage rate benefit, the bottom 10% were better off. In other words, their rate was higher than the top 10%. You can see how ridiculous this is. If the bottom 10% had zero, you could give them an infinite rate of return by just giving them $3. And of course, in the Bank of England case, it turned out the bottom 10% got enough to maybe get an extra 3 cups of coffee a week, whereas the top 10% got enough to actually buy a small studio apartment in Manhattan at the end of 6 years. And now, therefore, this whole kind of question of what's more important, the rate or the mass. And Marx is kind of saying, well, the rate and the mass work together. But in the Marxist tradition, they've been separated. I came across a very interesting sort of comment in Baran and Sweezy's Monopoly Capital. I remember it. And they said, we are going to be talking about the surplus. We're not concerned with the falling rate. So we're not going to concern with the falling rate of profit. And the reason was, we're now under monopoly capitalism, and under monopoly capitalism, things work differently. The coercive laws of competition don't work in the way they should do. So therefore, this whole kind of question of the falling rate of profit is irrelevant in a society which is monopoly capital. But the whole kind of question of what to do with the surplus becomes very, very, very critical. So all of the Sweezy school and Samir Amin and so on are all talking about what's happening to the surplus. And it's a very important kind of concept. Because if you want to understand where global warming connects back into this, it's because of surplus. And the disposition of the surplus and how to deal with the surplus and so on. And so the surplus comes, and so that whole school of thought is very much dedicated to the discussion of what to do about the surplus. And it tends to ignore very much the falling rate of profit argument. Now, if you go to certain Socialist Workers' Party characters in London, they're all about the falling rate of profit. They don't want to talk about the surplus at all. So you'll see Michael Roberts, who's a fantastically interesting guy, and I'm very grateful for what he does, but he's dedicated to the falling rate of profit. Wherever you go, down comes the falling rate of profit, And you're kind of going, okay, well, if it started going down in 1850, shouldn't it have hit bottom yet? What is this? So when I sort of challenged him and sort of said, well, how come you're not talking about the rising mass? He said, oh, I talk about it, but it doesn't really matter. So, here you have Marx talking about a contradictory tension between rates and masses. And then saying, well, what comes out of this is the formation of the world market. There's a whole theory of globalisation comes out of it, a whole theory and you can turn it into what you want to talk about domination geographically and imperialism and so the surplus kind of stuff is very, very important. But there are certain things going on in terms of the falling rate which are rather important and have to be looked at and have to be considered. So that what I would want to do is to say, well, why are those two schools of thought not talking to each other, and why they're not actually developing a real understanding of the dynamics of capital? Because, and here's this very interesting thing, when you've put Marx really into what he's doing something which is anti-equilibrium economics. Now, the topic of classical economics and neoclassical economics and neoliberal economics all have one thing in common. They're dedicated to the idea that there is an equilibrium somewhere. The market will bring you to equilibrium. You know, all that stuff that went on Wall Street in the 1980s was all about, you know, let the market do it and it'll come to equilibrium. It'll come to equilibrium. And so whole of economics is dominated by this idea of equilibrium. And I was saying to Michael beforehand, where did that come from? Who said the world has an equilibrium? What's it all about? Marx is not about equilibrium at all. Because as far as Marx is concerned, he's actually not dealing with demand and supply curves. You know, you've probably seen them, those ones that cross, and there's an equilibrium in the point, and that's it. No. Marx actually thinks the foundation of capital is what we call a backward bending supply curve, which is this. And a backward bending supply curve, the best way I can do is that. If you are a potentate in oil estate, you want a certain amount of revenue. You say, yeah, I want so many millions of dollars of revenue in a year. The oil price goes down, so what do? You pump more oil. So the price goes down again, and you pump more oil, and then you pump more oil, and you pump more oil. It's perfectly logical, right? You have a fixed thing. The same thing happens to farmers. If you have debt service, you've got to cover your debt service. So if the price of soybeans goes down, you grow more soybeans because that's the only way you can cover your debt service. So if anything is fixed like that, the only area in which this happens in economics is, of course, in the labour market. They always make exceptions because there might be a danger of a backward bending supply curve in the labour market, and that would be horrible because if the wages go up, workers might work less. So we've got to stop wages going up to make sure the workers work. So this is what a backward bending supply curve is. In Marx's terms, it's simply like this. If the profit rate goes down, how do you get the same amount of surplus value? You employ more labourers. You expand your labour force. And the further it goes down, the more you expand your labour force. And you say, well, where's the big labour force coming from? You know, it's interesting. A little piece of data. The global wage labour force has grown by 1 billion since 1980. 1 billion. This is what Marx is talking about. He's kind of saying, yeah, there's a falling rate of profit. You know, Michael Roberts things are going down, down, and down. But the labour force is expanding like crazy. Where is it all coming from? Well, it's partly because, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union, China enters the global labour force. There is a serious attack upon residual peasant societies, which are turning them more and more into wage labour. There's been an incredible feminisation, importation of women into the labour force. And actually, of course, there's always been population growth. Now, Marx says accumulation of capital and population growth have to go hand in hand. But there's a population problem emerging right now. There are about 50 countries in the world that have no increase in population. In fact, places like Japan and Italy have negative. They're negative. So the population stuff is sort of getting a problem. Those sources of extra labor, which were soaked up after 1980, are non-replicable sources. Yeah, okay? So there's real serious confrontation going to go on here. But you can't do this, expand the labor force. The labor force is not there. Now, before 1971, the world was structured in a very interesting way through the Bretton Woods Agreement. Each nation state had some degree of control over its fiscal policies and over its labor policies. So, in effect, there was not a globalization of wage labor. There was an English working class and a British working class. There was a German working class. And in fact, the theory of monopoly capital that Barana Sweezy worked with notoriously said, well, Detroit is a good example. 3 big auto companies. Well, yes, in the United States, there were 3 big auto companies. You were protected by the Bretton Woods structures so that you could work with them. This was the situation. When the Bretton Woods collapsed, the barriers to globalization of wage labor fell apart. And that's what has actually made capitalism survive through the 1980s, 1990s, till the present time. But we can see some really crunch points coming. Now, these are the sorts of things, it seems to me, that have to be looked at. Now, the big problem, and I share with Vijay a lot of the discussion about, the big problem of how different nation states are positioning themselves in relationship to all of this. The problem is, well, one of the problems is that, of course, in a particular country, one of the ways in which you could deal with this issue of expanding the labor force is through migration. Very difficult to do right now, as we see, the whole migration thing. So again, there's an issue here. So those are the sorts of issues that seem to me to be critical for us to look at and to understand. And it is true that, I get a little impatient sometimes with some of the rhetoric about imperialism and so on. It seems to me it's too easy. It's too easy, Vijay. Come on.
No, it's not easy. I wish it were easy.
Well, the rhetoric is easy, because everybody knows imperialism is bad. Everybody knows the United States is an imperialist power, blah, blah, blah. And, and if I start to think about the spatial fix and I see, well, actually, countries start to export capital when they start to be saturated, and you can date it. I can date it for you if you like. Japan started to export capital in the 1960s, and it made the mistake of buying the Rockefeller Center and a few things like that. South Korea in the 1970s started to export capital all over the place. Taiwan in 1982 started to, you'd be in Guatemala or somewhere and you'd find a Korean firm doing parts for sending to the Gap or something like this, and a Korean firm in South Africa. And so you kind of say, are these imperialists? Do we have sub-imperialism going on here? I mean, and so that goes. So the export of capital from Japan, and then South Korea, and then Taiwan, and then of course comes China. Exporting capital like crazy. It didn't before 2000. You have a map of export 2000. There was nothing there. By 2005, they started to pour money abroad. Now they give vast amounts of money because it's the only way they can mop up the surplus. And it comes back to the surplus. They have so much surplus in China, they don't know what to do with it. They have a huge amount of surplus in steel and cement production. Well, what do? You give credits to Kenya, or you give Kenya to East African countries or whatever, to build railroads. And they build railroads with Chinese steel and Chinese cement, and Chinese labor, by the way. So I don't know, is that an imperialist thing to do? Or what is that? Well, it is an important development, and I think that we have to understand that. I don't like to call it imperialism. Really don't. Even though some of the practices, if you look at Chinese corporations operating, working in Zambia, in the cotton belt, in the copper belt, you would worry about some of these things. So what is the Belt and Road? Okay, if it's not China restructuring the global economy in its own interest. Now, actually, I think it's doing some quite good things with Belt and Road, but I worry about, I don't want to get into this thing of, well, is China being imperialist and doing that? No, it's got surplus capital, it's got surplus labor. What is it going to do, particularly with the surplus capital? It has to export the surplus capital. So what's it doing? Okay, it's taking over plants in Hungary, it's taken over the Piraeus, it's a big port in Pakistan, it's one of the largest contributors to Ecuador, the largest. Again, I don't like. Well, the reason I don't like using the word imperialism, because these are real relations which are on the ground, and value transfers are occurring, and some positive things are coming out of this. I'm not saying that a new railroad in East Africa is a bad idea. I'm not saying that at all, or that they're going to do a bad job in the Piraeus, except that. If you think you can keep a union going in the Piraeus with the Chinese management, forget it. It's not too nice. So that's why I want to avoid, I think, that sort of thing. These things are going on the ground. We need to confront them, and we then have to ask the question. And this is one of the wonderful questions that does come up in the Grundrisse. Marx has a sort of figure on his shoulder. I don't know if this happens to you. I mean, as a writer many, many years ago, I always used to imagine there was somebody on my shoulder who was looking over at what I was doing, and therefore was kind of somehow or other judging me. And I, for a while, I'm horrified to tell you, I thought Althusser was on my shoulder. Oh, God, what a burden it was. And then turned to Poulantzas and was a bit better, and all the rest of it. And I was telling this to somebody, and they looked at me and they said, "You've been on my shoulder for the last 20 years." So, kind of the question of, who's on your shoulder, and why you feel somehow or other constrained to do things one way rather than another because of that. Well, I've got to the point now where I sort of got most of the monkeys off my shoulder, I think. But this is kind of a sort of serious issue for me in terms of trying to push our understanding of what socialism might mean by creating, as it were, a fictional character. And Marx does this in the Grundrisse, and it's the figure of what I would call the emancipated laborer. I think it's a very interesting idea, and I started to run with it. When Marx talking about something going on in terms of certain social relations and so on, and occasionally you get these passages where he sits back and he says, what would the emancipated laborer do with all of this? And these are the sort of questions you were beginning to get at when you were saying, in those communas where things, this is what the emancipated laborer would do with that. What would the emancipated laborer do with New York City right now? This is the sort of question, and it's not an easy question to answer. I used to think about, the question earlier on in my life was how to make a socialist paradise out of what you see when you go down the New Jersey Turnpike.
Wow, that's
Yeah, no, but it's real. It's real. And you say, well, maybe the highways are too big to fail as well, So, but this figure of the emancipated laborer started to become very fascinating to me, to say, well, okay, what would the emancipated laborer do in a situation of this kind? There are these possibilities existing. New things have been created, new technologies, new possibilities, and so on. And one of the things that happens is that we keep on finding those things which seem like they have fantastic positive possibilities, then turn around and go, and Chris has lived through this with the internet and with a lot of the communications. Again, what did the emancipated laborer do? And I think that's what we all would maybe want to ask when we're reading about some of these relations which are set up and the complexity of some of these relations, how they're working out on the ground. What would the emancipated labourer make of those Chinese investments? What would the emancipated labourer do with the new technologies which are coming on board? How would the emancipated labourer look upon artificial intelligence? This is again one of the big things that's coming down the pike. And we know it's coming down the pike, and in exactly the same way that so many manufacturing jobs were lost to automation, robotization, and all the rest of it during the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, leaving behind a population that is really alienated, thoroughly alienated, took to opioids thanks to the Sacklers and all the rest of it, and is part of this kind of feeling of totally alienated population, which in some ways I think can be tracked back to the deindustrialization of much of North America. And that deindustrialization is not, in a lot of classic Marxist thinking, considered a crisis. And I've had this argument before with people, and they say, oh, well, deindustrialization was not a crisis, it just went on all the time. Well, that was the crisis. And it was a much more important crisis than these things like 2007, 2008. And so then you ask the question, well, what would the emancipated labourers say about deindustrialization? Would they say we're against the technologies? Because about a third of that deindustrialization was due to offshoring. 2/3 of it was due to technological change. When I arrived in Baltimore, there was a steel plant there and it had employed 35,000 people, something like that. By the time it got to 1990, it had 5,000 people and it was producing the same amount of steel. It's now gone altogether. So technological change is there. And this, of course, is very much about the falling rate. That's where the falling rate's coming from. And that's the consequences of that technological change and that dynamism. And if you kind of go and look and see what came in the wake of all of that, well, we see that. I mean, I was kind of liked watching The Wire, which is about Baltimore, because it was very much about Baltimore in the wake of deindustrialization and what was going on. And so should we have been against deindustrialization? Well, people tried to fight against deindustrialization back then, but it didn't work. And I think the same is likely to come true of artificial intelligence. That it's going to be services this time, not manufacturing. And I think the emancipated laborer, and actually Marx kind of basically says this, would say, this is great. These are great. We then have to ask the question, how can they be used in a socialist way? How can these possibilities be utilized socialistically? And those are the sorts of questions, it seems to me, that I would want to see us addressing. And it has to be a collective thing. I mean, I've been blessed of having some really good experiences in Latin America and the like, mainly people who kind of figured out that what I wanted to see and how I wanted to see it, and I saw a lot and worked a lot with that. I've been blessed with that, and of course I have been in the past fairly active on the ground, unfortunately not anymore. But this has to be a collective exercise, and I think this is one of the things the People's Forum has started to pull together, and it's a fantastic kind of thing to have meetings of this kind, and I hope we have many more of them, and I hope that they're democratic and open and all the rest of it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists, and we'd like to open it up for questions from the floor. And so Leanne has a microphone, and she will come to you if you raise your hand, and you could address your questions to any one of our three panelists up here if you'd like.
Okay, I'm gonna end up rambling a little bit because I'm just referring to kind of scribbled notes. And I guess it's kind of going to be open to anyone on the floor if there's like a train of thought they want to run with. I'm so sorry for being that person, more of a comment than a question, so I'm sorry. But I really did think it would be useful to sit with the...
Easier for me to, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I think it's important for us to sit with the question of imperialism more. I honestly think that we can still address some of these questions, especially the questions as far as like the Republic of Korea or the Republic of China or Japan. Personally, Nkrumah's theories of neo-colonialism kind of emerge as relevant to me in that kind of trajectory. I feel like, and this also comes back to that point that was brought up. That was kind of about like deal with your own local bourgeoisie. Mm-hmm. And I feel like what is imperialism if not the repeated like blockages of attempts to essentially, deal, like the fact that there is a local bourgeoisie that is so corrupt, so horrible, so disgusting, across the world. Say Chile or Colombia or Venezuela is what immediately comes to mind. And then China as well, the fact that there's this corruptible petite bourgeois class, which by the way is fully acknowledged by the Communist Party. This is like the fact of corporations and the fact of a petite bourgeoisie and the fact of the existence of classes is all like acknowledged by that party. But that aside, what is imperialism if not the fact that these bourgeoisie are so entirely and utterly entrenched in these countries? The fact that like Allende's movement was completely crushed. The fact that Colombia operates as this kind of a proxy of U.S. policy or economic interests. The fact that like the Colombian police train with NYPD, train with the IDF, train each other, that kind of linkages. The military bases that are all kind of encircling. We were talking about the questions of high tech development as well. Again, I'm rambling. Let me just make sure I hit stuff I wanted to make sure I hit on. I had Thailand jotted down as well. Vijay's book, Washington Bullets, is really interesting. I feel like, let's think about like the fact that Thailand didn't have a revolution, for example, or the fact that Vietnam emerged into reforms, the fact that China presently exports capital, in whatever way we want to talk, all right, Belt and Road, whatever. We can talk about, the different perspectives on it, but the fact that it's emerged to this point and that we don't have the original standing of that kind of, third world project, USSR, China, funding of the PFLP, funding their arms, or just, the kind of East German development comes to mind as well, the way it's students going around the world, building up hospitals in Cuba or Vietnam or elsewhere. The fact that like these systems were entirely crushed and we've now been pushed to this new, form where socialism with Chinese characteristics, Vietnamese reform socialism, where the fact we're at this point is again a result of imperialism. Like you can't understand that development of capitalism, socialism, if imperialism isn't the central contradiction, particularly imperialism of the American variety. It's the fact that, right, like deal with your own local bourgeoisie, but the fact that the American left has been so utterly unable to deal with their bourgeoisie is the determining keystone policy of every other struggle, around the world. How do you address that if you're just gonna kind of, flatten it down to like, well, the Republic of Korea exports capital, or Taiwan exports capital. They're neo-colonies of the US, so they're operating, they don't have an independent financial policy. They don't have independent military policy either. You look at the US occupation of Okinawa or in Korea as well, like, I just saw like protests, they were like beating down like elders in Korea who were protesting like US, building up whatever the golf courses around their military bases. You see these military forces that protect all this capital, right? So like, I don't know. Again, I'm just gonna read this real quickly. Haiti comes to mind as well. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, we look at spatial development. How do we understand situations like favelas in Brazil are what immediately comes to mind. A product of capitalism and imperialism, and then Haiti comes to mind as well, where it's like, deal with your own local bourgeoisie. What is Haiti supposed to do? Haiti has been trying to deal with the local bourgeoisie for centuries. Haiti continues to struggle,
Can I come in there with you for a second, unless you have more?
Let me just, I'm so sorry for taking up so much time.
No, it's okay, it's fine. If you don't mind, guys, can I engage with?
Please.
Yeah, when you're done.
Okay.
But if you're done, then I'll engage with you now, because you've asked a lot of things.
I'm just gonna say this last thing that I actually wrote
please.
out. So this question of the enlightened laborer really sticks out to me. Because like socialism isn't about an imaginary enlightened labor. I feel like it may almost be like this kind of liberal concept of like some kind of labor with all the perfect questions that Marx himself came down from the heavens, touched upon his head. But socialism isn't an imaginary thing. It's what we are trying to build, what we collectively can build, And so to that question, it's not about like the great developments of what would the perfect laborer do? It's how we become the perfect laborer, or rather how we create the conditions in a world so that our children can become the perfect laborers to answer those questions. It's not about the imaginary thing. And especially for colonized peoples, it's just it's more about like the concrete existing historical and present struggle to create that kind of a world, which is inextricably anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist. These things are one and the same for the colonized world. And so again, I just thought it was really important that we sit more with the questions of imperialism, because if we don't, then the questions of capitalism, it's complete, you're gonna go down, it was Stalin who said something along the lines, of like, theory, theory without practice goes nowhere, and practice without theory gropes in the dark. We have to understand, the way that these different concepts are interconnected. And if we don't, centralize imperialism, then especially China, I feel like it's just gonna be a dead-ended circle trying to understand how they're acting. Because everything about China is in response to, the collapse of the USSR is in response to American imperialism. I mean, I wouldn't go that far with the USSR, but again, American imperialism, I think, is just a really essential question. I wanted to sit with it. Sorry.
Let me just come in with that, if that's okay. For me, imperialism is not a set of rhetorics. It's understanding a structure, a real structure in the world. I've actually never understood imperialism to prevent industrialization. It's about control of, let me put it another way. Just before he died, I talked to Samir Amin, who was a dear friend of mine and a great teacher and a person who understood things in his own way. And we had many disagreements, not the least of which about Egypt, with which he had his own views. But he's Egyptian. And nowadays in the United States, people say, let's hear from an Egyptian, as if that's somehow more credible, This idea, like, I get this sometimes. People say, we want to hear from a Syrian. Which one? Who? Like, what class background and so on. But, there is this sort of populism that has taken over people's imagination. I can introduce you to lots of terrible Palestinians, that are willing to collude and cooperate with the Israeli apartheid Zionist project and with US imperialism. Lots of Indians, including Narendra Modi, grotesque, and so on. Let's hear from an Indian. Let's bring Narendra Modi to speak to you. Yes, so I'm actually not interested in the idea of imperialism as a set of rhetorics, obviously. These are serious issues of structure. And yes, of course, capitalism will, seek out places where industrialization can take place and so on. But there are certain aspects of control. And this was the conversation with Samir. He said there are 5 or 6 areas of control which are, where there's no permission to export these things. One of them is science and technology. And David makes a lot about the refusal to allow capital intensive to go to certain places. Another one is financial systems. Control over financial systems is maintained. Control over arms and who gets to be the top dog militarily, maintained. These so-called freedom of navigation exercises. Control over communications, the information war. Just look at the internet. It'll say, this is a Chinese government website. When are you going to say this is funded by the US government? 90% of NGOs funded by the US government. You'll never get that on YouTube or Google or anything. Funded by the Russian government. This is information war. It's to delegitimize these sources of information. Now, I'm not saying they're all great, but that's not the point I'm making. The point is who gets to define things, How do you define what's happening to Venezuela? How do you define what's happening to Cuba? January 11th, okay, something happens in the morning. Miguel Diaz-Canel, president of Cuba, gets into a car in Havana, drives to San Agustin de los Baños, walks among the people and says, what's your... Have you ever seen a US president get into a car and go and talk to protesters? Every day, 3 people are killed in the United States by the police. Where is SOS USA? Never. But yes, there's SOS Cuba. This is an information war, guys. This is control over information. imperialism isn't a set of rhetorics. It's about the fact that there are these capillaries of control over certain aspects. Finance is a huge element in this. The SWIFT system, the ability to access capital through the IMF. I'll give you a little story. The head of the IMF, a very decent person, Georgieva, she made a statement saying during the pandemic we're going to release capital to countries that are struggling, that need to help their healthcare systems and so on. On the IMF website, it said that the representative from the government of Venezuela in the IMF, and it named a person who is a government official of the government of Nicolas Maduro. So the IMF got a request from the government of Venezuela for funding, for their own money, by the way, just to let you know, a share of their own money. The IMF refused the money. So I called the IMF and I said, what about this? You've got on your own website the name of an official, and you're saying that the actual government of Venezuela is in contest only by the United States, Britain, and half a dozen, formerly colonial countries or imperialist countries, whatever. A day later, this government official's name disappeared from the website. They disappeared the name. Now, talk about Stalinism and airbrushing. They just removed the person from the website. This is what I called the person again, and they told me, and I'm speaking to you on the record, they told me that the US Treasury Department is not happy with the US Treasury. What do they have to do with the IMF? You see, so it's control over financial systems. This is imperialism. Give me a better term to explain this. I'm not wedded to the rhetorics of, I'm not interested in standing at a square and yelling and screaming and fulminating and protecting my bourgeoisie. I would like my bourgeoisie to drown in its own spit. I don't care about that. That's not the theory. The theory has to manifestly understand these capillaries of control. You can use any other word if you want to give me a postmodern word. I'll take it into consideration, but you don't have a better word for it. Give me a better theory and I'll absorb it. And I'll tell you, this give me a better theory business comes from a Tony Kushner play. Tony Kushner wrote a terrific play called Angels in America. I don't know if you've seen the second part called Perestroika, where Ante-Diluvievich comes to the stage. He's the oldest living Bolshevik. You remember this? Ante-Diluvievich comes and he says, you NEP men, he's yelling at the Gorbachev people, you NEP men, you little snakes. He said, even a snake, he said, before it gives up its skin, grows another one. He said, I want a theory, give me a theory. You've rejected our theory. Even a snake, before it gives up its skin, grows a new. What is your theory? You don't have a theory. You are just going to wither in the sunlight. So if you give me a better theory than the theory of imperialism, I'll adopt it. But you don't have one. And what I find interesting in David's book is all the elements of the theory are there. For instance, the suffocation of certain parts of the world, and they are, in fact, certain parts of the world that are not permitted to move to capital intensive. Bangladesh, for instance. Why cannot Bangladesh move? And David, you make a lot of Bangladesh. Why can't Bangladesh move from labor-intensive production in the garment sector to capital-intensive? Is it a demographic problem? I don't think so. Yes, it's the domestic bourgeoisie in Bangladesh is ridiculously horrible. We would like to overthrow them. But is that the only problem? Are there other problems? Is there a lack of capital? How will they access capital to make the move to capital intensive and so on? See, Xinjiang, for instance, much in the news for other reasons, is basically capital intensive agriculture. David, one of the interesting features of this is I would like to send a subpoena to John Deere Corporation in Illinois, because John Deere has exported more farm equipment to Xinjiang province than any other company. Why are they silent when all this stuff is going on about slave labor in Xinjiang? Why doesn't John Deere come on the record and say, yes, but by the way, we also exported all these tractors and combine harvesters? How do you have this massive export of combine harvesters and slave labor in the same, Yes, because you have a fanatical, anti-Semitic Christian evangelic by the name of Adrian Zench, who came on Democracy Now! To talk about lies. Okay, that's what you have. That's control over information and communication systems. And that, you need a theory to explain that. And for me, that theory is imperialism. So just taking up from your views and so on. I agree with you. We need a theory. Give me a better theory, I'll adopt it. Until I get a better theory, this one is pretty good to me.
Take maybe a few more questions and then move on to our- All right, so I'm wondering if we could, we're running low on time, but I'm wondering if we could collect 2 or 3, or maybe say 3 more brief questions, please, and then we'll have the panel respond, and then we'll be wrapping up. Okay, so 3 short questions, please.
Thank you. Evening, everyone. My name's Glyn Robbins. I'm a Fulbright scholar at CUNY Graduate Centre, and in my other life, you probably can tell I'm not from around here. I'm a housing worker and campaigner in London, and I've been to 2 meetings today, and I'm trying to relate the two. This one, this evening, which was definitely more enjoyable than the other one, but the other one was perhaps a little bit more immediate because it was of housing campaigners here in New York City, who I should say have fought some fantastic campaigns over the last few years, but who I think have a real sense that I share, albeit I've only been here for 4.5 weeks, of impending doom, not just here, but across the country. And essentially this meeting arrived at a position of, we're faced with this tidal wave of evictions, or whatever metaphor we're going to use, and there's nothing we can do about it. And I feel as though the 2 meetings are related, but Vijay has said, we need to go for landlordism, but actually it's the landlordism that is coming for us. And so I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Hassan. My question is for Dr. Harvey, and it's on the notions of contradictions that you brought up. See, I've always seen imperialism as an international structure, rather than a myopic or individualist thing where one country is doing this country is doing this. Is this imperialist? Is this imperialist? Right? So you brought up the idea that when China deals with one contradiction, another contradiction appears, right? But if you take imperialism as this unified global structure, would you say that the contradictions that they're addressing, is it moving the Earth or the globe or humanity as a whole towards the new direction, despite the new contradictions that may be emerging on a local level or on a smaller level, if that makes sense? So I'm thinking about the grand contradictions that we're trying to fix, and is the direction that China is taking, despite the new local contradictions that emerge, is it making a move towards these grander contradictions?
Thank you. I'll try to keep this brief. It's 2 interrelated questions. I'm like 5 beers deep, so I can't think too straight. But basically the question is this, okay? I'm nothing. I'm just a fucking worker, right? I'm an office worker, and I'm sure many of you are. But as my life as a worker, and I think for many of you here, most of us, it seems like a very international audience, right? And that is sort of where capitalism is right now, where you have workers from all around the world participating in different countries, different locations, and at the same time, capital has gotten the ability to cross borders at will almost, within certain limits. So a question that I have is, right now, there's been several major strikes in the United States, or movements towards unionization, the BHM1 Bessemer, Alabama workers being primarily among them. Right now, there's also a Volvo workers strike, which I think was recently crushed. So a question that I have is, how does labor, how can labor actually overtake capital at this point? The unions are completely based upon the nation state, right? So you have labor unions in the United States, the AFL-CIO, and a collection of the unions within them that are based within nation state forms. But at the same time, workers internationally are not really being connected. And another point that I have related to this is the question of the Labor Party. So as like a fucking schmuck in the United States, I have the choice between voting for a Democrat or a Republican. The third parties are all nonsense. The left needs to actually have some sort of united front towards building a labor party, a third party which can actually push forward like mass demands, Medicare for all, sliding scale of wages in the transitional program that Leon Trotsky had set, for example. So a question that I have is, what can I actually do? I want to fight capitalism. I'm sure all of you do. What can we actually do to fight capitalism? That's a question that I have. Because otherwise, our time is just fucking wasted. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
You want to respond to those statements?
Well, I'm sorry I'm wasting your time, but this will often come up, and it is a serious issue. And Glyn indicated one of the things that is looming ahead, which is very, very, very dangerous. And but one of the things that we've plainly lost is the capacity to organize at a level and at a scale that can actually not only cross state bounds in the United States, but also work internationally. And I think that is one of the great losses. And of course, one of the great losses is the fact that there used to be some halfway decent socialist parties existing around the world. They've basically been demolished. France, Germany, Britain, Portugal, and it'll probably sound strange to you, but the left wing of the Democratic Party right now looks more socialist than almost any other configuration I can think of, with the exception of places like Peru and the like. But I think that there's a time for conversation and a time for action. I'm a writer and I'm not a good organizer. I can't even turn on my microphone. So, in a sense, I think we all have to contribute what we can contribute in the way we can, and hope that other people will be grateful for doing it. I mean, I've met many organizers, particularly in the urban social movements around the world, who are doing sort of fantastic work and so on. But one of the things that strikes me a lot is how incredibly time-consuming that work is in relationship to the outcome, which is often fairly minor, and therefore it's rather disheartening. And at the same time, we are also faced with what Michael was highlighting, and which something that bothers me a lot, which is the level of alienation from work, alienation from the political process, alienation in relationship to personal relations, alienation from nature, just alienation in general. It seems to be so widespread. And therefore, it requires, I think, that we pay attention to that alienation, because alienated populations don't necessarily go to the left. Alienated populations easily go to the right. And I think the lack of meaning and whatever else you may think is that Trump has given meaning to people, and they're clinging onto it. I mean, it's profoundly mistaken in my view, but nevertheless, we have to understand where that's coming from and what it might be about. And I think there are spaces in which we can have discussions, and yes, it would be great if we could organize more coherently. And there is some of that, I think, going on here. And I hope that this dialogue which we are having is going to contribute to it in some way. I just one other final kind of comment. I thought there would be a massive public reaction to the fact that about 7 million households lost their houses back in 2007, 2008. Well, when you look at it, you say, how come there was not more street action? And I fear that with another wave of evictions coming, we may, in 3 or 4 years' time, be asking that same question. And I think that this is an existential thing which is on our tables right now. And there has to be an anti-eviction movement, but as soon as you say that, then there's another movement which is an anti-this movement, an anti-that movement. And there is therefore a problem of concentration, if you like. And the interesting thing about the ultra-rich right now, the billionaire class, and what the billionaires are about, is that they don't have any trouble communicating with each other. And basically, politically, I think the reason they love Donald Trump is because he's an idiot, and a useful idiot, because the media pay so much attention to his antics that they forget to go after the billionaires. They're sitting there, and you take somebody like the housing question, Blackstone, Schwartzman, big supporter of Trump, just given, I don't know what it was, $150 million to MIT, $120 million to Oxford to teach humanities. But Blackstone mopped up all of those houses back in 2008. It's now the largest landowner in the world, or landlord in the world. Mm-hmm. And yes, I agree with you, we've got to go after the landed landlords, but also we've got to go after Blackstone.
Yes.
And therefore target Blackstone. So I think this is, they're sitting there right now waiting for the evictions because they borrow money up to the hilt. And guess who lends them money? There was a fantastic thing about them, by the way, that they borrowed money from the California state pension system. They gave them a lot of money. And one of the things they did was they took over some rental areas that were, run down, and they upgraded them and made them, upscaled. They had to evict people. And 3 or 4 of the people who got evicted were pensioners. So in a sense, they protected their pension by agreeing to their eviction. Now this is the kind of thing you're looking at, and you kind of say, this is why I'm anti-capitalist primarily. And I understand I'm anti-imperialist too, in that sense that I think Vijay is saying. But this is what is likely to happen. And so the big question is, what's going to happen to those evictions? Ideally, and I can have an ideal about this, well, there should be public funds being set up and set aside right now in a lot of the ways, and so that the municipality can take all of that and keep people in their houses if possible and turn it into affordable housing. Because it's right now we have this crazy situation where there's affordable housing crisis everywhere. Evictions are coming down the pike, and we should be able to use that. This is why the figure of the emancipated labourer appeals to me, to say, well, what would the emancipated labourer do in a situation of this kind? Well, it seems to me pretty obvious what they would do. And therefore there is something that could potentially be done. Meanwhile, you just look around you in New York and you see how much building and construction is going on in the midst of a crisis of affordable housing. Who put all that money into Hudson Yards? I mean, this is mindless, stupid urbanization. Absolutely waste, terrific waste of everything. And you look around and you see all this stuff going on, and you kind of say, why is there a crisis of affordable housing? Well, there has to be a very coherent answer to that. And I think there is a simple answer to that, and therefore there should be a really public protest and public alignment to set up the fact that a large number of people are going to be evicted from their housing and are already evicting, because one of the things that happens is people didn't pay their rent, they couldn't be evicted, and there are small landlords around who relied on that to cover their mortgage, and they're selling out, and they're already selling out, and Blackstone's already buying them up. So there has to be a public campaign around what this eviction are going to be about. And in a situation where you cannot tell me that in this city there is not the construction capacity to build as much affordable housing as you like. I mean, we could maybe go to Hudson Yards and repurpose it, though I imagine those people who would want affordable housing would never want to live in junk like that. Have better taste. So yes, there is this thing. There are issues of that kind. I hope we might be able to talk through some of those things. And I think the housing, the affordable housing question is a big entree in, because big capital has gone in there big time and is monopolizing the whole damn housing market right now, and is really getting a lot of money out of it. So there are things I think that could be done.
We're going to go to Michael and then Vijay for concluding remarks.
Just a couple things. One is in the book, David gives a really, I think, extraordinarily clarifying notion of this issue of rate versus mass. And you say, why does he keep talking about rate versus mass? Why do I keep talking about rate versus mass? Well, because the world runs on rates. I mean, capitalism runs on rates. That is to say, the way we conduct our business, the way we think, the way we fund, the way we debit, the way we talk about a world is about rates, right? And David has one thing which he didn't bring up, which is in the book. He looked at an environmental report that talked about the sunken, let's just say, the sunken toxic mass that interferes with people breathing, right? It's now twice the livable average worldwide, let's just suppose on hypothesis, right? Now, the rate of its increase, we get alarmed by, right? Now that we say, oh, it's up to 5% or it's up to 6%, and that means that in 20 years it'll be that percent. And David says, look, you can talk all you want about the rate, but you forget that the mass is unlivable, right? In other words, you're already built into the structure of our existence is an unlivable mass of toxic material that interferes with our breathing, okay? In other words, so you can't just sit there and say, well, we'll have a Paris, environmental meeting, and we'll agree to lower our fossil fuels and CO2 emissions by 10% a year. Well, we're already at an unlivable level, and that's what's missing when you obsess or you fetishize rate, okay? That's one thing. The second thing is the point I was trying to make about vaccinations is that it just suggests how, in a way, with the polio examination, right, is it just suggests how societies find themselves in very different places. And that a society that, frankly, a couple of us at the table can remember, that is to say, the United States in the 50s, was a completely different kind of place, right, from the place we find ourselves now, where the level of alienation across the board of refusal is also beginning to prompt what I see is a kind of a latent, not even latent, but a more manifest authoritarianism in our government, right? And this is tied into David's observation that neoliberalism as a program is bust. And so therefore, in place of neoliberalism and showering people with cash, if you recall, this is just the latest, showering. Trump, Bush, everybody has been throwing money at people now for, close to 15, 18 years, including this present crisis. And it really doesn't affect how people feel. It doesn't change their sense of kind of whatever you want to call it, inner desperation. The same reason they say, never mind, I'm not taking that vaccination. Who can I trust here? It's lying, it's this, it's that, it's the other. Guess what I'm saying is, I'm just trying to say there's all kinds of symptoms here that we need to keep in front of us, which indicate that, one of the unfortunate yields of our present situation is a state that will under liberal hands just as well as reactionary hands, as if there were a difference. Sometimes, I don't know. That it's going to lean toward more and more coercion because consensus doesn't exist. Okay? And I think David is trying to get at that in this book. And I think it just sends me back at night thinking, what do we do, right? So that's all I want to say, but thanks.
What do we do? Well, 30 years ago, I joined the Communist Party of India Marxist. 30 years ago. Imagine this. The Soviet Union was collapsing and I joined the Communist Party. That's how intelligent I am. I wouldn't have changed anything because I believe, my friend, you have to do things. There's no blueprint that comes at you. There's no theory that comes at you. There's no leadership that's in front of you that is clairvoyant. Lenin in one of his texts says that if you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. If you're not willing to make mistakes, you'll do nothing. You have to do things. You have to get involved in things. You have to try to euthanize the landlords. You have to do something. You have to get involved with other people. The point of struggle is to be involved with other people, not to have the correct ideas. You see, it's very easy to develop the correct ideas. We have in this country at least a civilization of grad students who each have the correct idea. But if you don't join together and build movements where you build it in compassion with each other, where you understand that you're not perfect, you're trying to build perfection. And not even perfection, you're trying to, what's that word, asymptotically attain perfection. Like a railway line, which looks like an infinity, it joins. As you keep walking, it keeps looking as if it's not joined. That's the nature of contradictions. You think you want utopia to emerge. If you don't want utopia, you wouldn't do shit. We are motivated by the desire for utopia. You got to do something, you got to get involved. You can't just say, what can I do? You just got to go and do. And then in doing, you'll experience things and you'll grow and you'll learn how to deal with other people. The most important thing in politics, by the way, isn't having the correct program. It's learning to be not an asshole. Learning to be in your cell meeting and learning with other people and figuring out how to talk to each other and just being a decent person as you try to model decency in the world. We're trying to model decency and honesty. That's what we're really trying to model. If Marxists are actually honest with each other, that's really what we're going for when we build movements. We want decency, honesty. We want you to go out in front of people. One of the reasons I love Ho Chi Minh is he keeps talking about that. Don't be bureaucratic. Don't be commandist. Don't tell people what to do. I'm not telling you anything to do. I'm just telling you, you got to experience the world. You can't experience the world in the pages of a book alone. There is no revolutionary theory without revolutionary practice. But by the way, that's a vice versa statement. There's no practice without the theory either. And by the way, Lenin didn't finish the sentence. And that quotation comes from What Is to Be Done, which is a book about organization. So yes, thanks for that. What he's saying is, there is no theory which is not then moved into organization which produces practice. It's not just theory and practice. There's not just two concepts there. There's organization. It's a core. The whole book is about organization, and yet people take that sentence out of the book and say, well, it's about theory and practice. That's because they don't want to build organizations. You can't build power unless you build organizations. We don't just want to have the right ideas. We want to build power. We want to win. I'm not struggling, by the way, for the sake of struggling. I want to win. I want to win. I want to abolish capitalism. I want to go beyond this system that treats people as inhumane, as inhumans, as like animals. We want to transcend this system. We don't want this. And to do that, you have to risk yourself in the world. So you can't just say, what can you do? Do something for God's sake. Next month, the International People's Assembly will be launched. If you want to know more about it, there's Manolo de los Santos standing behind the bar. He will tell you everything you want to know about the International People's Assembly. an international organization or network or platform of 200 political organizations from around the world, including the Workers' Party of Tunisia, Communist Party of Nepal, a whole range of groups. We have been building this for over 5 years. Why? Because we need international linkages. We need to build something. And you know what? Here's the other thing. We are willing to allow ourselves to fail. Because if you're not prepared to fail, you'll do nothing. That's the lesson I take from Lenin. We're building this. It's coming. You've got to get involved somehow. You've got to get involved somehow. In September, 26 research organizations from around the world are going to release a document at the United Nations. That document is going to be called A New International Economic Order. It's a nod to the 1974 New International Economic Order General Assembly resolution. 26 research institutes from South Africa, from Lebanon, from Italy, from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Argentina, from India, from China. 26 of us have come together to release this document. Look at this document. It's a post-capitalist vision. Because we don't believe in that nonsensical idea that you can't envision the world after capitalism. We believe you have to try. Because if you don't try, you won't do anything. If you're not willing to fail, friends, you will not risk anything. Don't worry if you fail. It's okay. We're human beings. When we don't have the God perspective, it's okay to fail. Don't beat each other up so viciously, because you somehow sit at God's perspective. You're there to judge the Vietnamese, to judge the Chinese. Of course, give criticisms, but not the way people do, attacking Cuba, saying it's state capitalist, it's this. I'm fed up with that kind of assessment of the world. Be in solidarity with people as they're trying to build something. If you don't do anything and are unwilling to fail, don't be so hard on people who are trying to do something. So, the converse of that, do something, friend. I'm speaking directly to you now. Find your friends and comrades, join them, build something. Build something, it will increase your self-respect. It will also, by the way, because you'll fight better, it will also, by the way, help you understand the chapter David has written on freedom. Because this chapter is about time. We have to fight to get people the time to build the world. The struggle isn't just about wealth. It's about time. People want the time, not just for leisure. They want to love their families. They want to be with their communities. They want to be political people. We need time. Our fight against capitalism is a fight to recover time. They have stolen time from us. They have stolen our neurological systems. They've made us stressed. We don't want that shit. We want to live as people. We want to actually inaugurate history.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists, David, Michael, PJ. So books are for sale over there, and I believe food and drink is still available. Is that right? Yes?
We're waving yes.
Yes. And thank you so much for being here. It's great to see everyone.